Order. The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the member for Aston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak against these shipping reform bills which are in front of us. And I do so because they are fundamentally protectionist in nature, will increase the cost of shipping, and this will then flow through to almost every product in our society. It's important that we take a very close look, Mr Deputy Speaker, at these 5 bills in front of us which together comprise the shipping reform bills. It's important because sea transport is a large and rapidly growing industry. It carries over 99% of international cargo by weight and about 75% by value. And about a quarter of Australia's interstate trade is done via ships. And this is supposed to grow exponentially. Indeed, it's due to double over the next by 2020 and treble by 2050. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's also important because coastal shipping flows through to everything we consume and nearly every business transaction that we have in an island continent. Australia has the 4th largest shipping task in the world, and it impacts nearly every resident across Australia. So this, Mr Deputy Speaker, is an important piece of legislation, not just for those who are directly impacted by shipping and use shipping, but for every Australian, because ultimately the costs of shipping flow through to them. At its heart, Mr Deputy Speaker, are changes to the way foreign carriers apply for and are granted permission to carry coastal cargo around Australia. In essence, creates a new licensing regime. Today there is a system in which non-Australian registered ships can be granted permits to operate single and continuous voyages in Australian coastal waters, and this is to be replaced with a new regime under which Australian-flagged vessels will have unrestricted access to coastal trade, and foreign vessels can be granted a year-long temporary licence to operate. The intent of the bill is to stimulate growth in the number of Australian ships on our coast and to maximise the use of Australian-flagged vessels. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have no concern about trying to support the Australian shipping industry, but it should not be done at the cost of efficiency and not where it brings extra imposts to Australian businesses who are already struggling against international competition. Mr Deputy Speaker, my key issue with this bill comes from its central objective, which I believe is the wrong objective for these shipping reforms. And the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, in announcing the package in September, outlined the core objectives of these reforms. And he said, "What we are doing is creating an economic and regulatory environment that will revitalise and sustain growth and productivity in our shipping industry." As I said, of course we support our shipping industry, but the object should be broader than just sustaining and growing the Australian shipping industry. Rather than the reforms should be governed by the goal of raising efficiency of the sector overall and ensuring globally competitive costs of transporting Australian goods by ship. That should be the goal, and it is a critical distinction, Mr Deputy Speaker. The goal of the government is all about the Australian shipping industry alone and ensuring its growth, whereas we are concerned about the efficiency of the overall Australian economy and therefore ensuring that there is an efficient shipping industry overall, where there's fierce competition between Australian providers and international providers. And Mr Deputy Speaker, by the government taking this narrower objective for these bills, they've essentially made these bills protectionist in their policies. And what protectionism does, as it nearly always does, Mr Deputy Speaker, is lead to higher costs. They do this by adding huge complexity and compliance from using foreign ship companies. For example, Mr Deputy Speaker, the new scheme requires international parties seeking a temporary licence to carry out a minimum of 5 voyages in the year. And this excludes from the market suppliers wishing to carry out, for example, a single coastal voyage, perhaps as part of a longer voyage from a foreign country to Australia and back. It also imposes a significant compliance burden, as those seeking a temporary licence are required to give details about their planned voyages well in advance. Mr Deputy Speaker, what this means is that businesses will become less likely to use international ships because of the uncertainty of the compliance regime, and the additional costs will be too great. Yes, this may well mean that the Australian shipping industry gets additional business as a result of these bills. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, what will end up happening, though, is that if this occurs, it'll be at the expense of all of the customers and all of their customers who use the shipping industry. Now, the government did not try to quantify, Mr Deputy Speaker, what the costs of these reform package would be to Australian businesses who use shipping. But the Australian dry bulk shipping users did try to quantify that, Mr Deputy Speaker, and indeed they commissioned Deloitte's consulting firm to examine the impact from a cost perspective of these bills. And what they found, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a number of the coalition members have said previously, is that these reforms will lead to an increase in the cost of coastal shipping of 16%. 16%, Mr Deputy Speaker. And they suggest that these will be borne by the users of the coastal freight. They found that the impact on our GDP over the period to 2025 will be between negative $242 million and negative $466 million. But it's a very clear negative on our GDP. And of course that is going to happen, Mr Deputy Speaker. If you increase the costs of shipping, you increase the costs of transport, then that flows through to every business that uses that, and it flows through to every family who uses the products who use shipping. It also, according to Deloitte's, caused the loss of 570 workers across Australia due to the increased costs of these shippings. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, this flows through, as I said, to the entire economy. If you increase transportation costs, whether you're increasing road transportation costs by putting a tax on diesel, or whether you increase shipping transportation costs through these protectionist measures which are inherent in these bills, then those costs will flow through to the entire economy. It will particularly hit, Mr Deputy Speaker, our manufacturers, and they will be hit at a time when they can least afford it. And I have a manufacturer in my electorate, Mr Deputy Speaker, a very successful one to date, who's extremely concerned about the impact of these shipping reforms. The manufacturer is Vance Belting Proprietary Limited, and it manufactures these huge conveyor belts which are used in all sorts of industrial applications, including in the mining industry. They employ about 145 workers directly and about 300 workers indirectly, and their major production site is in my electorate in Bayswater. Now, Mr David Stone, who's the General Manager of Vance Belting, says that these changes could put his entire business in jeopardy. And he says, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I quote, "The proposed changes in legislation which will threaten our new... These proposed changes in legislation will threaten our new press project and the future viability for manufacturing in Victoria. This change will force Vance to road freight all of our rolls of conveyor belting to the Pilbara iron ore region, which will dramatically increase our freight bills by about 40%. This increase could tip us over the edge in maintaining our competitive advantage from overseas manufacturers." Mr Deputy Speaker, that's the impact that this will have on the ground in our manufacturers across our community. And of course, this additional cost for Vance Belting and all of our other manufacturers which rely on the shipping industry comes on top of everything else which this government is doing to make it harder for our manufacturing. Of course, we know about the carbon tax, which is coming our way on the 1st of July, which operates like a reverse tariff. It makes our manufacturers more expensive to produce goods, but it doesn't make their international competitors' products more expensive when they import them into our country. We know about the extra regulations which this government has put on businesses. And of course we know that they have made the industrial relations regime less flexible for businesses. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, increasing the costs of shipping transport is just another nail in the coffin for our manufacturing industry. Mr Deputy Speaker, we should be doing everything that we can for our manufacturers and for other businesses at this moment, not adding to their costs. Of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, if a business, a manufacturer, increases its costs, then those costs will flow on to its products and therefore to consumers. So this bill is also going to add to cost of living pressures, Mr Deputy Speaker. And again, it comes at a time when consumers and families across Australia can least afford to have an increase in cost of living pressures. They know that electricity prices have been going up by 66% over the last 5 years. They know that water has been going up astronomically. They know that gas and childcare has been going up way in excess of the rate of inflation. The last thing that they need, Mr Deputy Speaker, is an additional cost of living pressures put on them through this bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, these are bad bills. They are protectionist in nature. They are a sop to the MUA, which are the major beneficiary of these bills. They will increase the costs to all the businesses in Australia who use shipping transportation, and they'll increase costs to Australian families. They should be firmly rejected, Mr Deputy Speaker, and if at the very least these bills should be put to the Productivity Commission to examine the impact of these reforms before taking them any further.